We are back on Play It Forward with Bobbin Ramsey, writer-director of Backcountry. Bobbin, thank you for being on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself or your film?
Sure. Thanks, Kostya. Yep. As Kostya said, my name is Bobbin Ramsey, and I wrote and directed a film called Backcountry. It was my first short film that I had ever written and directed myself. And it deals with what I say it's a movie about grief growing up in the mountains. It's about how we deal with our grief, especially at a young age, the kind of grief that really changes our own relationship to mortality, how we deal with that in wildly different ways. And I am an early filmmaker. I have about a decade and a half of experience directing theater.
Mm,
And so this is, I directed a horror film back in 2014 with some friends of mine. It was wild and messy, but I would say Backcountry is really my first foray into being a sort of originating filmmaker, sort of taking the ideas that are in my head, putting it on paper, and then making it a piece of visual art.
that's awesome, Bobbin.
Thanks.
I also did a little theater before film. That's how I came to it as well. I love Wild and Messy. I think over time as we get experience, it becomes less messy, but hopefully just as wild.
Yeah.
And you said grief and what was it? And the mountains.
Grief growing up in the mountains.
Grief. I was ready, like I heard a beer crack open in the background, and it was like, yeah. Excuse me. So you definitely super competent, especially first film. Um, shot, produced, acted. It's great to have that under your belt. Like,
Thanks.
huge. So that said, grief, you tackled a huge subject, which I think at the end, like every film is around mortality. Like everything comes down to death. So at some point or another. So it's just like how do we, dive deep into to get to there. And life. So wow. It is a great depiction of the extremes of how two different people, two characters come to face extreme pain that
Mm-hmm.
we call grief. And one character is ready to confront it and talk about it. And another character wants to avoid it and not talk about it. And for both characters, it is top of mind.
Yeah.
So that said, very first question to play forward is where did this live in you emotionally, this theme?
Yeah. I mean, I think like many early films, like it's a deeply personal story. When I was 24, the person who I was dating at the time, his best friend was killed in an avalanche. And he was 23 years old, sort of was just at the peak of this career as a backcountry ski guide, and it was just a horrifically sad accident. Um, and that was sort of both mine and my partner at the time's first relationship with death of a person, of a peer, of someone our age, and it really shook both of us. Obviously he was very, very close. This was his best friend since he was a child, so it was very, very close to him, and I sort of had an observer's view of watching what it was like for him to go through this. 3 years later, my cousin was killed in a car accident. She was also 23 at the time that she was killed, and that really brought it very, very close to me. Suddenly I was sort of the one who had the very, very deep, close relationship, evaluating who I was now in the wake of this tragedy, what it meant to be in relationship to my family, what it meant to be in relationship to death, and also just deep, deep grief at having lost someone who I loved so dearly. Um, and so I had these two experiences with grief at a fairly young age, and of young people. That is so important to me. Is like, a lot of us have experiences, losing our grandparents or even our parents at a young age. But for me, and I lost a couple of grandparents at that point, the idea that sort of the life force, the energy of someone so young could be gone so quickly, was really destabilizing, so destabilizing, in my sense of how I wanted to move through the world and what my values were and what I wanted to do with my life. And And one thing that I really noticed going through these two experiences was that each of these families dealt with grief so differently, wildly differently. Um, and something that I really tried to do both in my own experiences observing these losses as well as in the film is really interrogate and respect both ways of grieving. Um, Not to say that there's ever any one right way to grieve. I think that we're all stumbling through it every single time we do it. But I think that there were elements of both of these experiences where I was like, grieving is really complicated and really personal. And sometimes it can really bring people together and sometimes it can really tear people apart. So yeah, so that was sort of the seed for the film. And when I decided to make it, I used sort of the framing of the story is the story of the young man who passed away in the avalanche, and that, with consent and blessings from his family. I sort of used that to be both both a literal environment in which this happened, in which these people are experiencing, and also as a way to sort of encapsulate the
Mm,
massiveness of what
mm,
these young
mm,
people are trying to do, right?
mm.
I mean, it's not subtle, but they are hiking up this mountain of grief. They are trying to figure out, how do we get to the other side of whatever this huge thing is.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I really appreciate so much in what you said. The shock of the immediacy of death when it's a peer. All of a sudden it's like death isn't like way over there when I'm 90. It's like, anywhere.
Yeah.
And that can be really scary. Um, Especially when we don't know what it is,
Yeah.
you know. And I think you talk about in relation to it, I that when you say in relation to in relationship, you use the word in relationship a couple of times. How does that change your relationship to your parents? How does it change your relation to other people?
Yeah.
And that cues me into like, well, there's a higher awareness that you have about death and presence and lack of presence, and how that creates a dynamic that can shift in relationship to others.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I think there's something there that's important. um
Yeah, I think grief fundamentally changes your relationship to love. Um,
mm,
and I think that that's sort of what I was trying to get at with these
mm,
two characters is
mm,
one character, her grief is manifesting in a need for love and a need for
mm,
connection, right? She's like,
mm,
I suddenly realize how fleeting life can be, and so I need to make sure I have everybody close to me, so I'm
mm,
not so alone in this fear and this emptiness,
mm,
this sort of new emptiness. Whereas I think the other character, he is so afraid, the loss was so profound that he ends up sort of keeping people at arm's distance and saying it's
mm,
too painful, it's too
mhm,
painful to love when the
mhm,
possibility of this kind of grief exists.
mm,
um yeah, and I think that that was something that was such an intense thing. And in the film, it's sort of um one character is sort of encapsulating of one and the other characters encapsulating
mhm,
of the
mhm,
other. But I think in my personal experiences, both in myself and observing from people I love, it can go back and forth.
mm,
It
mm,
can be like the moment of like, oh my God, I love you, I need you near me, to no, 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 don't get too close, because then
mm.
what if you go away?
Mm-mm. I think that's really interesting observation about grief and love. Um, I'm sure you've read and heard of and come across Kubler-Ross. I can't remember her first name, right?
Yeah.
Maria, I want to say, but I may be
Yeah.
wrong. And she talks about the stages of grief, and
Yeah.
it's very well recognized. And she talks about the first stage of shock, which is anger. And I think it works well with your hypothesis of
Mhm.
why we're angry,
Mhm.
and then ultimately coming to acceptance, and that stage where you're more kind of wanting to bring people back in as well, that relationship to love. So I think really setting it up clearly in that framework that you've just put in its relation to love in a very profound way. the second question is the meaning of the film, and we've discussed it to some extent,
Mhm.
but the takeaway, and perhaps you can reflect on your own takeaway as a viewer.
Mhm.
What is it for you?
Mhm. I think for me, it's the bravery of continuing to hike up the mountain. I think that I watch these characters and I see both of them have changed by the end of it. I see that Piper has gotten a new level of ownership over herself and her grief. She says, "You may not want to do this, but I'm going to keep going." And I think that Joshua finds a new vulnerability that actually allows him to be face to face with his grief. Um, and so I think for me, I love one of my teachers who I took a screenwriting class from said that the first line of your movie should encapsulate everything you want to communicate.
Mm,
And I was like, oh my God, that's so that's so
cool.
heavy. How do you do
That's
that?
great.
And the first line of dialogue that I landed on for this film is, what are you looking for? And for me, that was sort of the driving force, both in making it and watching it, is I'm like, what are they each looking for? And at the end, I hope what I want the audience to feel, and what I think I see when I watch it, is bravery. The bravery to keep going. The bravery to face the things that are so painful. Knowing that moving through the pain is going to be the thing that gets you to a certain type of peace.
Yeah. Um, that's great. The courage to continue up the mountain, of course. And, each of the characters is in a position where they need to process it to heal, because that's ultimately what's going on, right? They've had extreme trauma and it's emotional, and now they need to heal, and there's no way to put a band-aid on that but to process it. And um you know typically, perhaps it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about processing grief. So many of the filmmakers that I interview, um their films deal with mental health in one way, shape, or another. And grief, if it's overwhelming, can certainly be a challenge to mental health. So, in processing it, definitely takes courage. And I think, what I hear you saying is, from whatever vantage point you're coming from, where you're like, hey, stay with me, don't go, or get away from me, I can't feel anything else. Um, you've got to get over that and keep moving, right, to a healthy balance. And so, what does a healthy balance, maybe even in your own experience, how did you get to that healthy place,
Yeah.
and what did it look like?
Yeah, that's a big that's a big question. I think a certain amount of it is trusting the process.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting on a very personal level. I think it's like kind of amazing that we are, um as a society, probably in our most accepting of all of the various things in terms of mental health that people are dealing with on a daily basis. I think therapy is the most normalized it's ever been. Being medicated is the most normalized it's ever been. Like, in a way, our society really is moving towards being able to hold the struggles of mental health. And even with that, I find myself so afraid of being able to be vulnerable, to have the days when I feel really anxious, and or to have the days when I just totally break down, or have the days like there is still. And for me personally, just to speak for myself, I still feel like I am battling this wall of, you have to look like you're okay. You have to, and like your processing needs to look a certain way so that we know that it's healthy. um And I think that one of the things with the many forms of grief that I've felt in my life is accepting that it is not linear. And that can be so hard, where it's like on a day when you finally feel okay, when you finally feel like I can breathe, like I don't feel like I'm about to fall apart. I don't feel like this anxiety in me is eating at me. And then 2 days later, you're so back in that pit again, can feel so demoralizing, and like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just do this? Um, and so I think when I think about what healthy processing is, and this is also sort of what I was trying to imbue the characters with, is like the idea that there is no one way to do it, but that you have to be honest with yourself. And I think that Piper, for example, she's like, I've been reading these books, and this is how you need to talk, and this is how you need to feel, which may be honest, true for her, but is not true for him. And I think for Joshua, he is like, I'm just doing this. I'm doing this because you need this. I don't need this. I'm fine, which is also acknowledging a certain lack of truth. And so for me, what healthy processing looks like, what it means to move through grief healthy, is being in relationship to yourself and a lot of forgiveness.
Mm.
Um, and I think,
Yeah, in a
yeah,
relationship, and by
yeah,
default, you mean an honest relationship. I mean, if you're in a relationship, right, it's
yeah,
there clear.
yeah. And I do think that this idea of forgiveness is so hard. It is so hard to forgive yourself, um, for hurting, you know? It's like, or I have found that. And I think that I really, it's important to me at the end that we see that Joshua is allowing himself a certain amount of grace to know that he fucked up and he hurt her and he hurt himself, and still be able to say, I'm going to keep going. And I think I do think personally that isolation is hard on grief. I think that being in honest relationship with people who can hold you at whatever state you're in is part of the way that you make your way through it. But pushing people away, I think, only leads to a sort of deeper spiral into the thing that can really hurt you.
Mm-hmm. You said grace, and that's a big word that a lot of people don't use. And I like it. And I'm recently, really have come into a relationship with grace. What does it really mean? How do you allow it,
Mm-hmm.
to happen? What is it?
Yeah.
Um, and I just want to reflect on what you said, and I think it's, what I hear you saying, it's you have, lived out your movie in the sense of that it takes so much courage to say what you have, right? It really takes a lot of courage to say that and open up. And I think, I don't want to blame society, because we are society, right?
Sure.
And like you've said, it's so there's, on one hand, it has become so accepted, right? I'm going to my therapist. I gotta get I'm taking, oh, it's just my meds, whatever. But on the other hand, it's kind of that slices both ways. And there is some, you can't get, and I think what I mean to say is that you have ownership. You got to take responsibility, right? You can go, you take your meds, you can take your, you go to therapy. That's great. Use those tools, but they're not going to do it for you.
Yeah.
And and I think a big tool, as you've mentioned, is truth, courage, and forgiveness.
Yeah.
Forgiveness is a huge tool.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that gets in the way for me often about forgiveness, or at least in the past, that has made me forget about it, is some expectation that I have of myself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that I'm not meeting it,
Yeah.
and I don't even know I have that expectation of myself
Yeah.
until I am somehow able to observe and say, wait, why do I think I need to act that way
Yeah.
or come off that way or be seen that way, right?
Yeah.
There's that whole other thing.
And it is, it's hard. We are socialized. We do internalize. I mean, like, it is, there's definitely a gender dynamic at play in the film, right? Like,
Yeah.
I do think that Joshua feels that he doesn't get to fall apart. That's not something he gets to do.
Yeah.
And that he has been socialized to feel that way. And I think, the other thing that I think is a big part of it is Piper has been sort of like put in this place of like the grieving girlfriend, and how that is constraining of her processing, right? Who does she need to be to everyone else in the aftermath of this tragedy, and how does that change her ability to process, right? And I think both of those are socialized and internalized things that are very much rooted in societal expectations of gender. Even if we are feeling it from within, acknowledging the way in which we are shaped by the world we live in.
Yeah, I think it's great to mention that. Super important.
Yeah.
Bobbin, last question to play it forward. Since
Sure.
making this movie,
Yeah.
how have you been changed as a person?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. You know, I think I am becoming in better relationship to myself as an artist.
Wow, it's
I
awesome.
think, yeah, I think I'm in graduate school right now, and for theater directing actually. And it is interesting to just sort of be in I keep calling it the washing machine, the sort of artistic washing machine where you're just on spin cycle constantly. And I think along this conversation of grace is this idea of like, what if this play or this film doesn't, not everybody sees it, or it's not successful by a certain metric that I've drawn up. And feeling a lot of anxiety about what it means to be an artist right now. Like, is art making worthwhile right now? We know so many things in the world are burning, literally and figuratively. Like, what does it mean? And I think I'm learning to give myself grace in that, and say I became an artist because art changed me. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't because I had some transcendent, beautiful experience watching narrative storytelling. And that's why I'm here. So I have to believe that if something happened for me, this can also happen for other people. And also, to be success means so many different things, and trying to be okay with the fact of like, maybe my film only gets seen by 25 people instead of 25,000 people. But if at least one person in that 25 feels moved, then that's a success. And it's just being in relationship to that's what feels, that's the way that I feel like I'm changing. And I think the other way is just trying to be better to everybody in my life, just trying to be a little bit better, a little bit more patient, a little bit more forgiving, and a little bit more loving, because it's really hard. The world we live in is not easy, whether you're an artist or a doctor or a restaurant worker or anything. Life is challenging, and we really can all be a little bit better to each other.
Damn, Bobbin, you're on it. You got it. You got
Thank
it.
you.
You
Thanks,
just keep
Cosia.
going for sure.
I appreciate that.
That's it. I mean, it's a healthy maturity as an artist, as a person, just growth. Like, it's none of the other spin cycle stuff matters. It's, wonderful, and I'm happy for you. And thank you for being on Play It Forward. Bobbin Ramsey, courageous filmmaker and storyteller.
Thank
Everybody, peace out later. Next time on Play It Forward. Bye, Bobbin. Thank you.
you.